Well, thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you to Marcia Eli and to the wonderful trustees and leadership of this remarkable institution. It is a great thrill for me to be here tonight, and I suspect for all of us, an even greater thrill to have the opportunity to hear from, to learn from, and to engage with one of the giants of the law, not just here in New York City, but nationwide, over really the past century. And I am really grateful for the chance to be part of this. And I myself have so many questions for Judge Weinstein that we would go as long as a Bill Clinton State of the Union, but we will do our best to keep it shorter than that. We are going to learn, I believe, not only about the law, not only about the courts and their place in doing their part to advance a sense of justice, but the city in which we live, the way it has changed and the way it hasn't changed, the way its eternal churning and ambition and movement has helped produce this remarkable career, but the times in which we live as well. The story, the simple basic facts of Judge Jack Weinstein's life are impressive enough, and you will hear about some of them, but I'll give you in brief a summary to root our conversation. He was born in 1921 in, of all places, Wichita, Kansas, a son of the Plains, and moved with his family to Brooklyn 5 years later. You will hear about the world in which he lived and in which he grew up. He attended the public schools and then attended Brooklyn College. He served as an officer in the Navy during World War II, and then went on to attend Columbia Law School and clerk for Judge Fuld, a great leader of the bar in New York. He was the very first faculty hire at Columbia after World War II, at a time, as you can imagine, of great change in institutions like that. And then played a role in the life of the law that's remarkable. He was a professor at Columbia Law School for decades. During that time, he was, among other things, the author of the casebook that was definitive on evidence, Weinstein's Evidence. Among the students who learned evidence, who he taught, I just learned yesterday, was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which is pretty remarkable in itself. He was one of the attorneys in the plaintiff's side representing the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in Brown versus Board of Education. He served as the county attorney of Nassau County in the 1960s and ran, when it was still an elected office, for the New York State Court of Appeals unsuccessfully. An engagement in public life, in the judicial branch, obviously, in the life of the mind, in electoral politics, in so many different ways. And so, and is now an adjunct professor of law at Brooklyn College, at Brooklyn Law School, if I'm getting that right. You'll correct me if I come close, I'll get a B at least, right? But all of that biographical information does not do justice to the judge and his impact. To those of us who are attorneys, and well beyond that, he is known as one of the most creative and significant jurists in the country, taking problems and challenges that frustrate all different parts of government, and in his courtroom, finding solutions, focusing on solutions, and bringing together some of the most significant doctrinally innovative cases in American law. I will have the chance to ask him about a number of them, but among the ones that are most well known as defining his career include the case that involved the thousands upon thousands of veterans of the Vietnam War who had suffered exposure to Agent Orange and who were able to receive in his courtroom and then subsequently some measure of recompense and justice. So many other issues that are of the moment and that involved real people facing real issues of justice came before him. And Alan Dershowitz, professor of law at Harvard, described Judge Weinstein, he said that he is the most important federal judge in the last quarter century. Burt Newborn, my colleague at NYU School of Law, summarized one of Judge Weinstein's opinions. He said it basically could be summarized: social justice is hereby abolished in the United States. I don't know if that was upheld or not, but we'll ask about that. So we'll have a chance in a bit to dive a little bit more into some of these cases and to ask at least some of the questions that I have, Judge, about your vision of what it means to be a judge and how the legal system ought to work and what role it ought to play in our life and our society. But as you described to me and as we're going to have a chance to hear, so much of your jurisprudence, so much of your life in the law is touched by the life you've had here in Brooklyn, here in this borough. And we are really thrilled that you're going to be able to take us on a little bit of a physically rooted tour of that life and this borough and the way it has played out in your work. So what you see here is a map, and I think it's going to perhaps be put up there. But Judge Weinstein, why don't you begin at the beginning, if you could, and tell us about your family and where you started and how you came to be here.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for coming. So many of you are old friends and new friends. And the most surprised person in the room, I'm certain, is me. I can't believe that young, callow kid of 4 who came from the little village, Wichita, the center of the Wichita Indian Reservation in Kansas, to Brooklyn in 1924, is standing here and hearing these exaggerations about my importance to the law. But I thought I might do or review briefly what I did last Thursday. I had my driver take me around some of the areas in Brooklyn that were important to me and still are important, many of which I had not visited physically since 1940. And it was somewhat like Rip Van Winkle suddenly waking up to an entirely different kind of society. When we came back from Wichita, we landed in my grandfather's house, which was on Rodney Street. And here it was between Bedford and Wythe Avenue being a main, as I recall, a main street for the trolleys. We must have arrived in the summer because they had those wonderful old trolleys which were open, and you sat in rows looking out on both sides. They were a wonderful invention, and those of you who never had that opportunity have missed some of what was available to poor people at that time. The poor people had many advantages that are no longer available to us. Well, the trolley car, of course, frightened me. So I crawled into my grandfather and grandmother's bed, and they comforted me. We then, they had come to Brooklyn from Russia in about 1905, shortly before the Russian Revolution. The local police chief had told my grandparents' parents that he was going to be arrested the next day, so they, the story goes, put them in potato sacks, a 15-year-old girl, which turned out to be my grandmother and my grandfather, and shipped them off to the United States, where they landed in Williamsburg. They had some relatives here who had already started businesses which turned out to be very successful. Horses and wagons, buying old clothes and buying old metal. I buy old clothes. Do any of you remember hearing that with a man going, or woman, no women, man going down the streets trying to earn a living? Some of those people turned out to be very wealthy, some of them being these people. My grandparents went aboard the various ships which were then anchored in this area and in the piers. This was a very heavy shipping area at that time, with packs on their backs, and sold things to the seamen. And then I think a German society said they should be farmers, so they sent them up to Rhode Island, but that didn't stick. They came back, they wanted Brooklyn, and he was trained as a shoemaker, and bought a little house on Rodney Street up in here. Rodney Street, it was 70 Rodney Street between Bedford and Wythe. It had his shoe repair shop, and on the corner a dairy. The dairy was not very successful. He used to pay their rent. We ate very well. We had fresh dairy products in lieu of rent. My grandfather would go to the Wallabout market and get fresh vegetables and fruit brought in by the farmers from Long Island and Queens. And we would have then 3-day-old bread from Ebbinger's. My mother told me, and for years I believed, and I still believe, that 3-year-old bread is better for you than fresh bread. This area had wonderful smells. I don't know whether any of you remember when they were roasting coffee, and you could, if you were too poor to buy a cup at the exorbitant prices they now charge, you could walk through the streets and sniff and get your coffee that way. And then they had bakers baking white bread. And the odor of baking bread and coffee, it wasn't much in the way of calories, but it was a lovely way to walk through the street. And as I remember, sugar had a smell because they were great big sugar distillers in here, the ships coming in through this area. This area that I worked in subsequently, and I'll tell you about that, was essentially set up commercially like it was in the Civil War. The freight trains would come into New Jersey, and then there would be freight yards all along here with a railroad running in the streets, a very efficient way of supplying material and taking out finished goods from the factories along here. I'll skip ahead and say that during World War II, this was a great area that produced an enormous amount of products necessary in the war, some of which I handled as a young man. Well, my father became a cash register salesman, first Jewish man in the National Cash Register Company. He went to Dayton, Ohio for training, and the NCR had a beautiful office here in Atlantic Avenue, which later deteriorated into a kind of a paint factory. And he lost his job in the mid-30s they just fired him. His territory, and I'll tell you about that, was in Coney Island, which became an important place for me because he knew all the merchants and he had free passes, and I'll tell you what we did with those. I had my schooling here in Bensonhurst, next to the mafia, next to very good Italian people who were on our block, and Germans, and a few Irish people. And we went to 205 public school, which was then in the early 20s, heavily overcrowded with the young people who were born following World War I, which had an increase in population, young people, much as it did after World War II. The education was excellent. I was a terrible student in 205. Fortunately, I had a handsome father and a beautiful mother. My father visited the lady teachers and explained why I should be kept in school and not put back. And my mother visited the male principal, and between the two of them, they more or less kept me at 205 until I came to Seth Low with the intermediate school, where they gave an intelligence test. I was always in trouble. Intelligence test, and then the principal called me in and he said, Jack, I know you're not a very good student, but we're going to skip you 2 grades. And from that time, I had less trouble with the teachers. And then from there, after Seth Low, I went to Brooklyn College, to Lincoln High School, rather, in Coney Island. So we lived up in this area, and we went down, I walked to this area to save the nickel fare. And then after Lincoln, I went up to Brooklyn College, all free education. Brooklyn College at that time was newly built with WPA funds. And the building with WPA funds of so many major buildings, including the library up here in, at the tip of Prospect Park, made me a firm believer in what the government can do when it is properly handled, and has affected a good deal of my feeling about government and its effectiveness if properly controlled. Because much of my life depended upon buildings like Seth Low and Brooklyn College, and also the library here and the museum. The library was started in the early 20s, and some of you may be old enough to remember. It was just an empty building during the 20s and the 30s until the WPA gave them money to build a beautiful central library. That library was important to me, as was the museum. My mother was brilliant. She got the gold medal in PS 4 in Williamsburg. Her father said, you can't go to high school, even though the principal said she should. And so she used her sister's working papers to go to a factory where she stripped feathers. She was remarkable. She had a large library and read a great deal, and was quite a remarkable figure who could have, under present circumstances, since Ruth Bader Ginsburg's work and the work of so many other women have enhanced the opportunities of women. Our own court, which was less than equal, there were all males when I was there, all white, now has more females, and a chief judge who is a female and a wonderful leader in this great court. So she was a product of a society that had many advantages, but was very cruel towards women, African Americans, and other people of differences. What's happened since World War II was, to me, remarkable, and the opportunity to work with Thurgood Marshall on the Brown case and on many other cases involving segregation of a variety of kinds, gender, sexual, and other kinds, has been a great thrill, I think, to all of us, and so many of us who are lawyers here have participated in this remarkable change. It is an entirely different world with respect to the protection of all of these people who are somewhat different. So during the 30s, about 1935, when I finished high school, fairly young, I think about 16, I had to go to Brooklyn College at night because my father lost his job and all of us in the family worked. My mother, who was brilliant, did all kinds of things. I did things. I was on Broadway for a while, not because I was a great actor, but because I needed the $25 a week that Equity insisted was a minimum for actors. And so was my mother on there with me. So I acted from time to time. I posed, she posed, we did anything to keep food on the table with my father unemployed, a brilliant man. Some of that food had landed from trucks. As poor people then, and I suppose to some degree as poor people now, we ate food that had fallen off trucks, meat, fish, and other things, and we traded. My father, for some reason, caught a lot of spaghetti. And he traded the spaghetti for wine with our next door Italian neighbor. And also we traded fish because fish fell off, and also because we fished together from this area in Brooklyn, which was at that time, the center of a very productive fishing industry. There were fish just jumped into the boat practically. You didn't even have to bait your hooks. Big fish jumped into your sacks, and we used to give them around to the people. Well, I had to go to night school. So this is another difference between then and now, and between some of the minorities, and we were a minority. The area where my grandfather lived was essentially Irish, turning Jewish. I remember very well the first election I participated in, the Smith-Hoover election of 1928. I was then about 7, I guess. I went out into the street. There was a gang of Irish kids there. They surrounded me and they said, "Are you for Hoover or Smith?" What did I know? Hoover sounded like a nice name, so I said Hoover. Whereupon I got a bloodied nose. I have never voted for a Republican president. That was a lesson well learned. So I got a job. Now this is a difference between some of our minorities, and we were a minority at that time in Brooklyn, Jews. My grandfather had this little building. One of the people that he helped was a man, Al Burns, who was starting a little trucking company. He had 2 trucks in 1926. I looked them up on Google today, and his name is on Google. The firm ended in 1985. So my grandfather said, my grandson needs a job. And my father, who also knew Al, said the same thing. There was a network. Young people had help getting their first jobs. There were ladders going up. You could get help up to the bottom of the ladder and then climb up. A lot of the kids now simply don't have that kind of network. And the other thing that was interesting about that was Al Burns welcomed me. We had about a dozen Irish, mainly Irish, but Italian, Sam Lewis, and one German who in the 30s was a Nazi. I thought it was just a formal view. He felt he was a German, he had to be a Nazi. Because he was very kind to me, apart from the fact that he denounced me as a Jew. But the other people in the other drivers, and Al Burns, who had never gone beyond grade school, were so interested in seeing that I succeeded that they did everything possible to help me up. Sometimes driving me to Brooklyn College at night because they wanted me to succeed. I was one of them, poor kid, and I was on my way up. How many of you have seen the movie Brooklyn? I was struck by that movie because the heroine, you remember, is rather ignorant, coming from Ireland without much of an education. She goes to Brooklyn College, and there, after the first lecture, she says, "What are they talking about? I don't know." But she learns some things that are very important, and when she goes to Ireland and steps into somebody's job as an accountant, she explains to the manager in the most sophisticated way the differences between the British accounting system and the American accounting system, which she had gotten at Brooklyn College at night school. And it was remarkable for me sometimes, working on the docks, sometimes lifting ingots of aluminum, running around from one of these depots to the other, to take a trolley to Brooklyn College, and then in the evening to be exposed to the Greek philosophers and to mathematicians and to others. It changed my life. I was leading a double life. And that free, absolutely free Brooklyn College, I had a completely free education up to post-World War II when I had the GI Bill of Rights, was remarkable. It made all the difference in the world in connection with my ability then to move on. So then when World War II started on December 7th, the next day I went down to volunteer, and they told me that if I got my degree, I'd been going to night school for 6 years, if I got my degree, I could be an officer and go to Columbia 90-day school. I took about 40 or 50 points that spring and summer. Graduated cum laude, magna, I guess. No, I had a magna. And then became an officer in the Army, and I found that in the wardroom, discussing things with the other young officers, my education, public education at Brooklyn, enabled me to be at the same level intellectually and with respect to background as these people who had gone to Yale and Harvard and so on. It was remarkable, that system. Later on, I was heavily involved in Brown and as a judge in desegregation in Brooklyn. I had the Mark Twain case out here, which involved an all-black junior high school, and had to negotiate. I walked the streets of that area. It was a deteriorated, bombed out, red-lined, all-black neighborhood created in part by the city sending all of its welfare people there and by the federal government allowing redlining and so on. That school is now still successfully desegregated as a magnet school. I know there's some people that have gone there. But I walked those streets. And I was, as a result, horrified, and that has affected my work in desegregation in many ways, as has the fact that after all, I ate stolen food, to put it bluntly. So I had some understanding of what poverty meant and what the pressures and vectors were on people. My boss and these other men I was working for were remarkable. My boss used to insist that I study for my tests and give me time off. I was given time to go up on the Williamsburg Bridge. We were on South 6th Street, right under the Williamsburg Bridge. That's where we had our barn. I did stupid things. I left the barn doors open at night. I was supposed to close the doors and open them in the morning, 60 or 70 hours a week, and then school. I left them open from time to time. I left the safe open. I did all kinds of dopey things because I was a dopey young kid. And the boss never said anything. He knew my grandfather. He knew my father. There was a community support system that was willing to close its eyes to some things in order to help people to move upwards. I used to do my homework on the Williamsburg Bridge. At that time, the tugboats were burning coal, and my homework was always full of soot from the coal coming up. And it was there that I first saw the Japanese maroons, those beautiful white ships that were coming up the East River to collect steel and iron, which were turned, of course, into projectiles, a couple of which was shot at us later on in the war, and we, I think, sunk one, which possibly could have been one I saw here. But the war changed everything because it made a sharp difference between where I was. My discharge certificate said I was entitled, as a matter of law, to go back to Al Burns at $30 a week. And I took the GI Bill, and everything changed. Education was completely free. That made the difference, and I think it made the enormous difference in the way our economy and society operated post-World War II. It was a cutoff, a differentiation between an old society where classes were fixed, as our new society is now becoming, into a society where you could proceed on merit with the assistance of your community, a lot of little communities, and an educational system. Well, there's a lot more I would like to tell you about fishing and all the things we did. I just stop here with one more thing. I've got all these pins that represent spots of importance. I met my late wife at Brooklyn College. She was handing out cigarettes free. Remember when they did that in order to induce people to smoke? I was doing my homework at the reflecting pool, beautiful reflecting pool, with flowers, studying, and this gorgeous young lady came over and said, "Would you like some of these cigarettes?" I said, "No, I don't smoke." "Well, maybe one of your relatives smokes." "No, my relatives don't smoke." So she walked away, and then I met her in the stacks of this beautiful new library where we were both doing research for some thesis. I invested $1 in her. I took her up to Manhattan for $1. You could get a steak dinner. For 15 cents, you could go to the movies, and for another nickel, you could get home. Unfortunately for me, she lived in East New York, this red bar. I lived here, so that after every date, and it was always chaste, it was a very chaste thing. After a while, I was permitted to hold her hand. I'd have to come back here. Well, that clearly involved marriage. Nobody wanted to completely spend their time on the subway. Well, the scene that I saw last Thursday was so different from what I imagined. This whole area was one of the great industrial areas of the world that got us through World War II. And we were delivering things. And Roosevelt in the 30s was closing up Wallabout Market and building the Navy Yard. And I saw all that, and it's all changed. And I can't believe that little kid who was scared by the by the trolleys is here, and I have this great professor and head of the great Brennan Institute actually lying about all the great things that I have done. But I forgive you, and I think I've told you enough about this. But if any of you want to chime in or tell me about mistakes I've made, I'd be delighted to hear from you.
Well, I have a couple of questions, but I know that the folks in the audience are rapt and have so many questions and perhaps recollections of their own. My question really goes to what you've described as a system and a community that enabled upward mobility for immigrant or poor people. And what we have now, which in some ways, as you said, creates more opportunity, but in other ways has shut off avenues of opportunity. The case you talked about, the desegregation of Mark Twain School, was sort of one of the great examples, in some ways a rare successful example of where a federal court helped to desegregate an institution, and that was in your first decade on the bench.
Yes.
And in 1974, and recently you lifted the order because the school had been, as you ruled, successfully desegregated. What did you bring to that case, and what did you take away from it?
I was absolutely horrified at the neighborhood. It was housing that caused a large part of the segregation. The city was dumping all of its welfare people in. The housing was deteriorated. The people who were essentially Jewish, who had lived in that community, and some Italian, not many, had moved out from this area in the Mark Twain area to other parts of Coney Island where white housing had been built with federal funds. The first case I had with Stanley Fuld was the Stuyvesant case, where he dissented and said, when Stuyvesant's town was built, you remember that huge conglomerate, essentially with federal money. He said when they have a federally funded project, it has to be open to all people, not to white people. That was a minority opinion, but that changed the situation. So it was the housing that caused the problem here. And what I tried to do, I actually went behind the scenes. There's a lot of secret stuff that goes on in the, at least in my court, and behind my court. I don't know about the other judges. But in connection with this case, I was so disturbed that I actually went and saw the mayor. And the mayor and the corporation council listened to what I said. I said we have to desegregate the housing, we have to change the police, we have to change the transportation, and the amount that would be required would be about $250 million. I had a professor at Columbia who helped me set it up, and it was turned down. It was turned down because the money had to be spent partly in Harlem and partly all over the place. And we eventually used a magnet school, which worked particularly well. But I was also fascinated at that time by the difficulty of getting people together. The Italian community was stable, and they didn't want to have their children, many of them were going to parochial schools anyway, but they didn't want to have anything to do with this group. And they didn't certainly want desegregated housing. A number of the African Americans in the segregated housing didn't want that either because they had positions of power within their local community that would have been jeopardized by full integration. So much to my surprise and the surprise of the NAACP attorney, a young student of mine who was practicing and trying to support desegregation. They didn't want desegregation. They were happy. They didn't want the whites involved in essentially what they were doing. So the only way we could do it was, we could get to it was through this system where it was made into a magnet school and people from all over Brooklyn wanted to get in. As a matter of fact, I was told that the Seth Low teachers were very angry with me because here I was a graduate of Seth Low trying to take away some of their white students and put in some of their black students. So there were all kinds of difficulties and vested interests when you get involved in what is a built-in system of segregation, in some measure an artifact of slavery, and in some measure a deliberate intention through Jim Crowism that goes over many years. It's a very difficult problem to deal with. At the present time, New York has slipped back and is one of the most segregated school systems in the country. And of course, the Supreme Court over the years since Brown has backtracked. So it's a very difficult thing for us to do. It's necessary for the judges to know what's going on in the community and to be sympathetic and compassionate, but we are bound by the higher courts and what happens in the Supreme Court. So that's Mark Twain. And I've walked those streets many times since. It's now a clean community and a beautiful school. And, it worked.
So many of the other judges, some of the both trial judges and intermediate appellate judges chafe at the possibility of being overruled by the higher courts. That doesn't seem to be a factor.
I really don't care one whit. Sometimes I make mistakes and I should be overruled. We have, fortunately, a very bright, open Second Circuit with wonderful judges. And sometimes I think they're wrong, but we go on. Sometimes I'll decide, knowing that I'll be overruled, but when you have, there's an article I wrote in the Fordham Law Review some years ago dealing with this problem of what the judge should do when he or she knows and feels that what the law requires is not right. We have that with sentencing, minimum sentencing, particularly where I'm bound to send young people sometime for long periods to prison where it's inappropriate. I destroy the person, I destroy the family, and I destroy the community. What do you do with that? We had it during before the Civil War. What do you do when, under the slave laws, you were bound in the North to pick up the slaves and send them back to the South, the escaped slaves? Well, you can resign if you don't want to. That's what everybody says. If you don't like it, get out. Can't stand the heat of the kitchen, get out. Or you can go along silently, or you can go along and say this is wrong and it should be changed. Or in some cases, as I have been doing in some of the minimum sentence cases, I have refused on one ground or another to follow the law because I know that it has to be changed. So it is a difficult problem that when you're a part of an organization that requires you to do as part of the discipline, and we have to be a disciplined legal system and court system, otherwise everything would fall apart. So how do you get that play in the joints is a very sophisticated and difficult thing, and it continues to bother me. Fortunately, I have brilliant law clerks, two of them here and others scattered in the audience, who explain to me how I can distinguish prior cases.
Well, I know I have questions about the Agent Orange case and about the case where you allowed a suit against gun manufacturers to proceed, but in the end it was not able to. A topic we may actually hear specifically about in the State of the Union tonight. Because it revolved around the law that President Obama is saying he will not campaign for anybody who isn't for overturning that law. But I know that other folks have questions and comments as well. So why don't we throw it open to all of you? And so many of the people who you know and have worked with are here. And there's microphones. And it would be wonderful if you could say who you are.
There's nobody here from the Court of Appeals to the Supreme Court, so you can feel free to ask any kind of question you wish.
They're down the block. That's it.
Judicial reform is the issue of the day, apparently. Given the things that you've already said, what are your priorities if you could make any reforms that you wished? What should we work for and toward?
Well, it depends on whether you're talking about the systematic way of dealing with cases, and that is constantly being reformed and changed. We're bound by the federal rules. In my part, we have something that looks somewhat like the federal rules that we employ, and that works very efficiently, and each judge changes. And the system is fairly good, except that the Supreme Court has been closing the door to many people in connection with cases. In 1938, there was a great reform in the federal practice, opening the doors wide. to people through discovery and other ways, through class actions later. Those doors have been closing. The class action has been circumscribed. The jury has been somewhat discouraged. A good deal of discovery which permitted a plaintiff to get information has been closing down. So the operation of the forms have been, in my opinion, going in somewhat the wrong way, although the judges have still enormous flexibility, and our chief judge and our chief magistrate judge spent the afternoon with all the judges and magistrates trying to understand how we could meet the requirements of the Supreme Court and yet get a justice system that was fast, efficient, and relatively cheap. And the federal system is working fairly effectively. Judith Kaye, who just died, and Chief Judge Littman of the New York Court of Appeals have done enormous work in setting up separate courts. They just set up a separate court for guns. They set up a separate court for narcotics. We have done some of that work following Judith Kaye, and some of it on our own initiative with the help of our wonderful chief judge. And we are working on that, and that's an ongoing process. With respect to substantive law, there it's become much more difficult to escape what is, I think, a closing door. For example, the Supreme Court now strongly enforces arbitration clauses which are attached to various contracts, contracts of adhesion. They're somewhat bothersome because it means you don't get, in many cases, an effective litigation in the court of law. Those of you who read the Sunday Times, you saw the article on poisoned water by one of the big manufacturers of chemicals using the class action to get relief. That's also closing down. So it's hard to answer that question. I ran for chief judge in the New York Court of Appeals, not because I wanted to get out of the federal system. I would have had to retire 25 years ago at the age of 70. What would I have done with myself? Gone out and made a lot of money instead of doing what I love to do, come in and try to help individuals in the courtroom. It's very difficult. But in New York, we're fortunate. We have an excellent chief judge, have had one. We have a fairly decent system. I revised the New York practice, and that helped a little. And, I think we are, I think in New York, getting a better system. But it's a very difficult thing because the law is and should be essentially rather conservative. It can't move too quickly without upsetting what people do in society and what they expect from the court. So it has to sometimes move in little steps. But I think I can assure you that, at least in our court, under our chief judge and others, we have been moving forward and improving the system and resisting some of the retrograde movements in the high courts.
Can you tell us what you're proudest of as being a judge practice now close to 40 years?
What I'm proudest of?
Yes.
That I can get up every morning and go to work. It's exciting and interesting and fascinating. Who thought I'd be here? This poor kid frightened of the trolleys here in front of this wonderful crowd in this beautiful courthouse with wonderful colleagues, great cases, wonderful young lawyers helping us. It's the greatest job in the world. I'm going to do it until I can't. It's just wonderful. Every day is just wonderful. I can't wait to get it in the morning.
Well, Judge, I relate to everything you said about your upbringing. I was born in Williamsburg. My parents were American, were born here, but we did ultimately settle in Coney Island. I went to Mark Twain Junior High School.
Which one?
Mark Twain Junior High School.
Yes. After I desegregated
No,
it?
before. It was segregated, as a matter of fact, because there were no black kids in Mark Twain Junior High School. It was all Jewish, some Italian. It was all Jewish, white, and we lived in Coney Island. Many of the houses were summer houses. The city,
What year were you there?
let's see, I went to Brooklyn College too.
What year were you living in Coney Island?
I was born in 1933. I grew up in Coney Island. I had my bar mitzvah there.
When did you get out? When did your parents move?
When my parents got out after I moved out, I went into service. I went to Brooklyn College. I graduated from there.
When did your parents move?
1962.
Yeah, by that time they were all moving out because they were putting the African Americans in there, and when I came in, it was 100% African American.
Well,
As a result of terrible governmental policies. And you're lucky you got out. Because you're lucky you were in that school when it was a good school. It was not a good school when I saw it. And that neighborhood was completely deteriorated. You must remember the houses falling apart, the city putting welfare people in. That shouldn't have been permitted. That was a step backwards, and it was a terrible fight to stop it. Yes?
Tell me about your thoughts about practicing law when you started with mimeographs and now there's electronic discovery with PACER and computers and electronic stored information. What's your thoughts?
Well, we were discussing that today. What do you do about electronic discovery? Well, they've changed the rule. There's a rule on electronic discovery. And our chief magistrate judge was lecturing to the other judges today on how to handle electronic discovery. And I listened, and I'm going to handle it just the way I handled it before they changed the rule. To see that everybody gets to know what's going on. So that's where we are with electronic discovery. But if you come before one of our magistrates, they know how to do it. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Take the microphone so I can hear you. Please.
Good evening. I wanted you to talk a little bit about your work with the NAACP.
Work is what?
With
To
the
talk a little bit
NAACP.
about your work with the NAACP.
Yes. I was appointed to the faculty at Columbia in 1952. I had my own practice. I was at the top of the class, or close to it, and had a very good record. I couldn't get the kind of job I wanted downtown because they didn't want Jews in the firms that I was interested in, so I opened my own practice. I made a lot of money fairly quickly for a variety of reasons, nothing to do with my skills, but with the professors that I had met at Columbia, and Stanley Fold, and other friends I had made. That always helps to have powerful friends who can recommend. When I was appointed, Walter Gellhorn had been running a little seminar with Jack Greenberg. You remember, he became head of the Legal Defense Fund, a wonderful lawyer. And I was asked to take over the seminar. I took over the seminar. I went down to the city bar. There was this enormously impressive person, Thurgood Marshall. He's a giant. He pulled together lawyers and sociologists and statisticians from all over the world, all over the country, and was able to bring along people with special interests in not changing the system. Remember, there were a lot of African American teachers in the South who were poorly educated, and everybody was afraid that they would lose their jobs and so on. He pulled everybody together. He was just wonderful. And I went down and worked with him. It was, for me, an experience to meet lawyers from all over the country and help. I didn't do very much. I was kind of a fly on the wall and did minor work on the briefs and things. But I think, like the truck drivers who took me on as a kind of a mascot when I was 15, he took me on as a kind of a mascot when I was in my 30s. And I thought that what he did with the Brown case and the others that worked with him, devising the law school cases where the Supreme Court justices could understand why separate but equal didn't work, because you wanted to, in your law schools, get to know people who would be colleagues and would work with you. So separate but equal was a killer in the law schools. And then they went to the graduate schools. And then after they had a solid base, they went to the grade schools. It was a remarkable intellectual feat. Very, very similar in many respects to what Ruth Ginsburg did when she was appointed head of the section on gender for the ACLU, and developed the cases one by one on gender. The first breakthrough, isn't it brilliant? Wasn't the case involving discrimination against women that she used. It was a case involving discrimination against men, because the Social Security Act provided that the widow would get certain benefits from Social Security, but not the widower. And then the court said, well, that's not right. They were forced, and then she worked up, and women did a fantastic job, which was very much parallel. But with respect to women, I'll call it the desegregation of women. The desegregation of women succeeded beautifully and very quickly. Not completely, but very quickly and effectively. And I think the reason for that was that so many of the middle-class men were married to intelligent, brilliant women, had daughters, and could see in their own homes, like my mother, women who were stultified by a system that didn't give them opportunity. Now, with respect to the desegregation of African Americans, that was a much more entrenched, and still is a much more entrenched system, which, as I say, has many of the artifacts of slavery and Jim Crowism. Remember, that during World War I, the president segregated the District of Columbia, insisted on Jim Crowism, and that happened in many parts of the world, of the country. And the Republicans gave up its changes in the system in the South, all the schools it built and the troops that were down there, in order to get a little political advantage. So there is that difference, and it's a job that we have to do, and it's a very difficult and expensive thing to do, but it must be done in this country. And now all this talk about keeping out Muslims and discriminating, it's got to stop. This country after World War II became a shining city on the hill. It was just beautiful the way it was going. I have a feeling it's moving backwards. We have to stop that. More questions? Yes. Sir. Oh, sir. Excuse me for taking over. I'm an old law school professor.
And
Judge, thank you so much for being here. I feel it's a privilege, and I'm enjoying every bit of it.
But
I'm going to maybe put you on the spot. You're speaking in front of the Historical Society tonight, and I'd ask if you could comment on what I would call history in the making. There is a case before the Supreme Court right now about what one man, one vote means.
yeah,
Does it mean one resident or one registered voter?
yeah.
You have a long history of dealing with voting rights. I don't think it's fair to ask you, how would you decide this case? But could you give us some of the stronger arguments on each side, and could you tell us what would happen if it was decided one way or the other way? Thank you.
Well, obviously, if it's going to be voters, two things are going to happen. To the extent that voters are discriminated against and prevented from voting by new registration requirements, by the case just decided that declared invalid the law, insisting that the changes in voting requirements be approved by the Attorney General, now resulting in a smaller voting base, it's going to affect adversely some states like New York, which has so many non-voters, unfortunately, immigrants. My own feeling is that the easiest way, the best way to handle it is through the census, because here you have essentially a constitutional built-in way of finding out who's who and who's what, because the Constitution required a 10-year census of who's in each one of these areas, and that is solid meat, solid material. So I would myself prefer that, and I was very active in the one-man, one-vote work in New York. I was head of the Democratic Committee that insisted that the people in New York and in Nassau have the same voting strength per person as the people upstate. And there are all kinds of problems here that have to be worked out. But it seems to me a workable system should be the system inherent in the Constitution based on people residing in the area, which is the census method, the present method. But I'm not going to decide that.
Could you please say something about your idea that the jury should know the sentence? That the jury should know what the sentence is going to be?
Well, I said so, yes. I got reversed.
How would,
The Second Circuit said no, that they shouldn't know what the sentence is going to be. In some cases, it's horrendous, and they would have found the defendant not guilty if they knew what the sentence was going to be, 15 years. I said that they should know, based upon my research in colonial history and in English history, where all the jurors knew exactly what the sentence was going to be. If they didn't know, the judge told them, if you find 5 shillings, he's going to be executed. If it's under 5 shillings, he'll be sent to Australia. The judge told him that. So you look at the bulk of the verdicts in England, year after year, is just under one pence or whatever it is, under 1 shilling. That's the way they came in. So those people weren't executed. Unfortunately, our law is so complex that most people don't know what the sentence is going to be. I think that's wrong, but the Second Circuit has been very clear that my history may have been right, but my decision was wrong.
I think we have time for perhaps one more.
Somebody got a really good question.
Or we can
Well,
even
that
go-
lady
we can
put
go
her
to-
hand up first.
Thank you. When my husband Jeremiah was buried 3 years ago, he was a 100% service-connected, combat-wounded veteran of World War II. He did not get a gun salute, and when I called Fort Dix to ask why that had happened, I was told he didn't have enough rank.
He what?
He did not have enough rank in the service.
Rank?
Rank, yes.
To get a gun salute.
What did you say, Judge?
Not enough rank to get a gun salute.
That's correct. And at that time, when I called Fort Dix and they told me he didn't have enough rank, I called the Department of Defense. A couple of days later, they stopped the disability payments, and I had applied for it shortly after he died for disability compensation for dependents. And the problems that I've had for the last 3 years have been that they awarded me his 1945 GI Bill benefits that he never used, 70 years after the fact. So I've been appealing to the VA board, the Board of Veterans Appeals, and hope to go to Washington to testify. I just needed to know if there was anything that you might suggest to me.
Patience and fortitude.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Well,
I
thank you,
certainly
everybody.
appreciate
And
it.
thank you to Jack Weinstein.